scares you? What really terrifies you? Snakes or spiders? How about flying? Are you afraid of heights, of public speaking, of closed-in spaces? Some of those things may frighten you and cause you anxiety. They're phobias, irrational fears. What I want to know is what really makes your knees wobble and leaves you awestruck. I must admit that I have a couple of phobias. One phobia is being in deep water. You see, I'm not a swimmer, and I want my feet to be able to touch the ground. So perhaps you can understand the fear that engulfed me on an evening on the lake when my family had gone on a camping vacation. Paul's parents were at the camp with our 3 young children, and Paul and I had taken a small aluminum fishing boat out on the lake. This was a lake about the size of Glendo, and we were some distance from the campground when the storm came up. It hit pretty quickly. The sky went dark, and the wind began blowing. And the calm waters became swells. I couldn't see a thing in the inky blackness of the night. We headed back to the campground at full speed, which wasn't at all fast in this small boat. I don't know how Paul knew what direction to steer the boat. And did I mention the boat didn't have any lights, just a couple of battery-powered lanterns. I held on for dear life as we bumped our way across those choppy waters. One wrong move, and I was sure we would be drowned. How could our relaxing evening of fishing turn into such a catastrophe? And you better believe that I was calling on the sleeping Jesus to save us. Jesus, do you not care that we are perishing? Now, I have a feeling that you've had times like that too. And I think our friends, the disciples, were having one of those days when they were all together in the boat. I don't know about you, but I can certainly sense the panic that was inherent within. But what is it that the disciples really feared? It had been a long and trying day for Jesus and the disciples. They were crossing the Sea of Galilee at night. They were on their way to the Gentile side of the lake for the first time. The boat that carried them was not at all that large, about 26.5 feet long, 7.5 feet wide, and 4.5 feet high, and had a deck fore and aft. It held about 15 people, and 4 of them were probably rowing. I sailed in a replica of this boat on Galilee when I was in Israel. The thing about the Sea of Galilee is that it is in the deepest part of the northern Jordan Rift, 700 feet below sea level. It's surrounded by cliffs on all sides except the southernmost leg. Cool winds frequently rush down these slopes and unexpectedly stir up violent storms on the warm surfaces of the lake. Waves can top 30 feet. As you may recall, at least 4 of Jesus' disciples are fishermen and have surely survived storms on the sea and have also surely known fishermen who were lost at sea. They are very strong, self-reliant men who could handle moderate danger as a matter of course. But the danger on this evening is not moderate, but deadly. If the boat heads into the wave that is higher than the boat is long, it will get pitch cold end to end, and it's doomed. Or if the wave that is higher than the boat is wide, hits it from the side, it will capsize. Jesus' disciples knew enough to sense this danger. Listen again to what our text says. A great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat, so that the boat was already being swamped. But Jesus was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him up and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" Fear is a remarkable motivator. For just as fear can move us to call upon the sleeping Jesus Christ with, "Don't you care? We are perishing," fear also erupts when we realize that this dosing Lord possesses the ability to calm the water and still the wind. Mark says that the disciples, after seeing what Jesus did when they awake him, began to fear with a great fear. In other words, the disciples experienced a whole new dimension of fear after Jesus delivered them from the storm. It is the difference between the fear of Good Friday, "Jesus, don't you care that we perish?" and the fear of Easter, when the women leave the tomb and do not tell anyone. Because why? They were afraid. Interestingly, it is Jesus who names the disciples' fear when he asks why they are still afraid even after the danger has passed. Once the wind ceased and there was dead calm, then the disciples get scared, really scared. Jesus picked up on the look on their faces and says, "Why are you afraid?" He doesn't say, "Why were you afraid?" but "Why are you afraid?" Right now, after I have calmed the wind and the waves. And they were filled with great awe and said to one another, "Who is this that even the wind and the sea obey him?" Great awe in the Greek is bobenmegan and is literally translated great fear, or we might say faithful fear. It is the fear of being in the presence of a great mysterious holiness. It is amazement combined with the sensation of being weak-kneed and wobbly-legged. It is the realization that this man in our boat controls and has authority over nature and the chaotic forces of the sea. We often join these disciples in this fear, for we too recognize the signs of a threatening storm, such as a bad report from our annual physical, a difficult job evaluation, turmoil in relationships, protests in our streets, and gun violence in our neighborhoods and workplaces. We often feel like little David standing before a giant Goliath. Think of how often we come up against the bully on a playground or in the workplace, or in the courtroom or in the doctor's office. At these times, we know what it is like to be small, powerless, and on the bottom. We know what it is like to be exposed to power wielded by another who is larger, richer, and more armored than me. Augustine says this, quote, "When you have listened to abuse, that means you are being buffeted by the wind. When your anger is aroused, you are being tossed by the waves. So when the wind blows and the waves mount high, the boat is in danger. Your heart is in peril. Your heart is taking a battering. On hearing yourself insulted, you long to retaliate, but the joy of revenge brings with it another kind of misfortune, shipwreck. What do I mean? Because Jesus is asleep in you. What do I mean? I mean you have forgotten his presence. Rouse him, then. Remember him. Let him keep watch within you. Pay heed to him." End of quote. We would expect the disciples to rejoice at the calming of the sea, but instead they are afraid, greatly afraid of Jesus' godly power. And they are wondering out loud about who he really is. Really, all they had asked for was a little leadership and help bailing out the boat. But what they got was a miracle. Godly, unbelievable, incomprehensible. It was scary in its power and and it challenged their faith. That's what Jesus is getting at disciples failed the faith test. They are afraid of Jesus. They should believe, they have heard him teach, and they have seen him work miracles. But fear wins out over faith. Throughout the Gospel of Mark, questions about faith and fear plagued the disciples. It is a well-known historical fact that Birmingham, Alabama was the center of a storm when the civil rights movement began. It is also well documented in history the complicity of most of the Christian church in supporting racism. Having facilitated 2 8-week studies on racism, I cringe each time I see the newsreel of the old footage of Bull Connor and his orders to use fire hoses and German shepherds to keep the marchers under control. Or when I see the faces of poor little girls who were killed when a bomb exploded in their church on Sunday morning. It was in Birmingham that Martin Luther King Jr. wrote his famous letter from the Birmingham jail. It was sent in response to a letter he received from 8 pastors of mainline denominations in the downtown area asking him to stop the protest. One of these was Dr. Earl Stallings of Birmingham's all-white First Baptist Church. First Baptist Church became a focal point of the movement, and on Easter Sunday, April 14, 1963, Andrew Young and several other African-American young people came to worship at First Baptist. Following the service, Stallings graciously greeted the church's guests at the door and also gathered for the church members, photographers, and reporters. The next morning, papers all over the country, including the New York Times, printed a large photograph of a cheerful Stallings shaking hands with his visitors. Stallings stood face to face with the Goliath of racism. He continued to allow black worshipers in his services. The sleeping Jesus was awakened within Stallings. While some found encouragement in the picture, others deplored this integrationist stand occurring on the doors of the church. From that point on, Stallings' home phone rang around the clock with messages from segregationalists who were members and non-members of the congregation. The storm continued to rage, and several years later, Dr. Herbert Gilmore followed Stallings as the pastor of First Baptist Church. The church had been hosting after-school tutoring for children who lived across the street in government housing. One of these was an African-American girl, Twyla Fortune. She and her mother, Winifred Bryan, began to visit Sunday school and worship at First Baptist. After several years of visiting, Twyla told her mother that she was ready to make her profession of faith and be baptized. Winifred contacted Dr. Gilmer, who visited with them in their home. He left knowing their desire to join First Baptist would stir the winds of chaos into tornadic activity. So on a Sunday in October of 1970, Twyla and Winifred walked the aisle of First Baptist Church to present themselves as candidates for membership. They were told that First Baptist was not receiving new members and that their application would have to be deferred. Over the course of the next weeks, and after many late-night discussions, some lasting until 2 in the morning, their application for membership was presented 3 times to the congregation's vote. All 3 times, they were denied membership. After the 3rd refusal, a layman, Dr. Vern Williamson, stood in the sanctuary and said he would like to talk with anyone who wanted to be a part of a church that would welcome individuals like Twyla and Winifred. The sleeping Christ was awoke, but not only within Dr. Williamson, for immediately 300 people stood and walked out of the sanctuary of First Baptist Church. Eventually, this remnant of 300 became known as the Baptist Church of the Covenant. For you see, once the sleeping Christ awakens, our eyes and our hearts open as well to the possibilities that might occur if the love of Christ is set free to touch the lives of people. It can be as fear-invoking as when the winds cease blowing at a command. It can also be as faith-empowering, just like when David confidently faced Goliath with a slingshot. Frederick Buechner has said, quote, "Christ sleeps in the deepest selves of all of us, and whatever we do in whatever time we have left, wherever we go, may we, in whatever way we can, call on him, as the fishermen did in their boats, to come awake within us and to give us courage, to give us hope, to show us each one our way. May he be with us, especially when the winds go mad and the waves run wild, as they will for all of us before we're done, so that even in their midst we may find peace, we may find Christ." End of quote. The disciples, on the one hand, are scared to death of Jesus, and on the other, filled with awe. Faith is what helps us separate anxiety-ridden fear from the awe that sends us to our knees. Faith separates fear that holds us back from the faithful awe that calls us to action. Faith delivers us out of this worldly, panic-driven fear and into a life of faith-filled action and thanksgiving. Jesus' call to greater faith is not a call to be rid of the awe, but a call to not give in to the fear. Awe is that healthy, faithful fear that comes when we sense the overwhelming presence of God, or when we contemplate the greatness, the awesomeness of God. Awe is what keeps us from making God in our own image. And awe is what keeps us from making God into a cuddly teddy bear or a wish-granting genie. Awe is what reminds us that God, creator of all things, author of life, and defeater of death, is in charge, not us. Fear, on the other hand, has the power to become an idol that we bow down before. It causes us to panic and run away, hide our heads in the sand, and generally act in unfaithful and unproductive ways. That kind of fear and anxiety is what God calls us away from. It's that kind of fear and anxiety that the gift of faith leads us out of, in order that we might come to give thanks and to bravely follow in the footsteps of Christ as we work toward a world where love and justice for all will prevail. This is ultimately my prayer for each of us. It is my prayer for our church that the presence of Christ be among the people and in the music, in the preaching and in the prayers, in the mission and in the service, in the rough and in the smooth sailing. But most of all, I pray that the presence of Christ will be so alive and awake in our spirits that the truth of the gospel will not only be spoken, but heard and carried out into the world, so that love and justice of Christ may be done. Amen.